to hear from David Martin, a sustainability strategist and landscape architect who has significantly contributed to climate change adaptation standards and facilitated urban green infrastructure planning frameworks. Not only is he a local, but he's a respected lecturer across multiple universities. David enriches programs in sustainability, architecture, and urban ecology, leaving a lasting impact on education and practice. Today he is here to share the critical role green and blue infrastructure play in urban cooling and share his experience working on local research project Smart Irrigation for Parks and Cool Towns, also known as SIMP CT. David, over to you.
Thank you, David, for that introduction, and it is a great pleasure to be here today. I know we've got a big online audience, so I'm going to wave to people that are joining us online, and those that are going to probably listen to the recording that's going to come out of this session. So I'd like to thank Willoughby City Council for inviting me to participate in this great event today. And I'm going to be talking to you. I've got the gig, I think I said to my colleague who's going to be talking later. Funnily enough, I've got the gig to warm you up, talking about community cooling and the role that trees play in that as one of the great co-benefits that trees, among other things, provide to local communities. So my discussion and presentation to you, and it's entitled Green and Blue, Our Urban City, community cooling in the Willoughby local government area, but I'm actually going to be providing a bit of a case study and some of the lessons learnt from doing a project where I've been working up until quite recently out at Sydney Olympic Park, a project called SIMP CT on the benefits which really show to people the benefits of trees and open spaces and green spaces. And more importantly these days it's being referred to as green and blue infrastructure. Dr. Sebastian Fausch, who I've collaborated with, and we're going to show some of his work that's being currently done for Willoughby City Council on measuring urban heat trends in Willoughby local government area. He's been doing a lot of work in Western Sydney, so he's very excited to be given his first gig by a local government to record and do urban heat mapping in what we would call east of one of the eastern suburbs or eastern parts of Sydney that's got a coastal benefit. Now, this slide was provided by Sebastian just to sort of set the scene. I think accepting the science of what's going on, this is a graph provided by the Australian Bureau of Meteorology for New South Wales, just showing the long-term trend in warming going back to 1910 right up to 2020. And I think you can sort of see that there's an upward trend towards a hotter, drier climate. We are having periods of intense rain as well, but you know, things are getting kind of mixed up, and trees and parks and places and people have to be look at this more highly variable climate that we're all living through. As I said, I really wanted to focus on maybe people starting to think about trees on their own gardens and private property, and the tree populations which councils increasingly call urban forests. They are a form of green infrastructure. They're actually now officially recognised in a national document that I've had some role in playing called the National Handbook of Green Infrastructure. And if you're into the climate change adaptation standard that came out in 2013, the green infrastructure sector was defined at a national level. So there's no argument that we can talk about this stuff as blue and green infrastructure, because those things have been nationally accepted in those sorts of high-level documents which are aimed at state and territory and local governments and private organisations. But today's emphasis is really about what people can do about valuing what trees do on private property in their gardens, but also the shared trees in the neighbourhood, and even the trees that City of Willoughby is responsible for. We're going to talk about community cooling, and also in response to things you've heard a lot about, the jargon of urban heat island. You probably heard of that. You may not have heard of Park Cool Island effect. This slide was provided by Sebastian again, and you can see in this sort of illustrative cross-section, I think we all know that things do get a lot hotter around built environments. They absorb heat during the day and store it and radiate it back at night. But then we get a dip down where we do have urban bushlands, and you'll see this actually coming out in some of the work that Dr. Fausch is doing for Willoughby City Council, that clearly temperatures are cooler where you have mass effective trees, but also in suburbs and gardens that have a higher level of tree canopy. It's not just occurring on public land, and this forum today is really about getting people to value the trees on their own private land and in their gardens. So some cooling principles, again a slide provided by Dr. Fausch. You know, it is a bit scientific, but in terms of, you know, the absorption, transpiration, how the movement of the water and water vapour through the soil and through the air, through the tree, that these things, from a scientific point of view, there's very strong proof of the benefit and how these cooling effects come out of trees and green spaces, and is a good way of dealing with hotter, drier climates and extreme heat events. The case study that I wanted to talk about, we're going to leave Willoughby as a coastal council, and we're going to move out to the western part of Sydney, where we know it can be 5 to 10 degrees hotter than living in. We're very lucky and fortunate that we live near a major body of water when we're a coastal council, but in the case of Sydney Olympic Park, even though it is on the Parramatta River, there's a real drop-off in the cooling effect of the ocean and the harbour. Now, this cut and paste image on the right just shows you, you know, how much hotter other parts of Sydney are compared to Willoughby. Willoughby's challenge is to try and maintain its coolness, and looking at the challenges of southwest Sydney and western Sydney around Parramatta. Sydney Olympic Park is in an orange zone, slightly under the Parramatta label, but the project that was born out of a really bad event that had happened in the black summer of 2019-2020 led to the creation of this project called Smart Irrigation Management for Parks and Cool Towns. It was co-funded through the Digital Restart Fund that the New South Wales government had at the time. Sydney Olympic Park Authority, where I was working, provided the space, but a lot of the money came from Sydney Water, involved several universities, people from Perth. It was a real big team, and you'll see in a minute the people that made up. It's a smart project. I'm not going to talk about all the tech today. That's a whole other lecture that Sebastian really needs to give. But it involved digital twinning, artificial intelligence, with the view that trying to make the management of water more efficient, with about a 15% saving, as well as letting people access live information based on the 250 sensors in the soil and those that are placed 3 metres above the ground, measuring air temperature, humidity, wind speed, as well as soil moisture, the benefits of that. The project has won a lot of awards, the Internet of Things Australia, IOTA. It took out 2 national awards. It won the major award for Banksia Foundation New South Wales. It was a finalist only several weeks ago for the Banksia Awards nationally. To set the scene, here I've got the hot air balloon of Sydney Olympic Park, or what's called Olympic Peninsula, or GPOP, looking back towards Parramatta. The project, and I don't have a pointer, but I'll just say that the area that the project, this is Bicentennial Park, is down located in that bottom left-hand corner. There's a lot of mangroves and salt marsh and migratory waterbird refuge there, but the other part of the park was landfill. From the 70s, it was Strathfield Council's old municipal landfill. It's built on it's capped landfill, so it's very sort of susceptible to either getting waterlogged during extreme rain, but it dries out very quickly. So it's a very vulnerable but much loved regional park, and increasingly with all the apartments that are being built across the road from the park, it's increasingly going to be a local park 7 days a week as well as a regional open space. So it's a park that's working very hard for a lot of people, and it's a park that has to be protected, knowing these vulnerabilities to things like heat waves. We know, in this slide I've used at a congress in Singapore, and you can see that that was back in 2018, and this was a water plaza that I was involved in the design of at Olympic Park, and that was a headline in the Sydney Morning Herald back in 2018. I think you all know, only 2 years later we almost had 50 degrees out at Penrith. So getting back to that trending graph, you can see just how much heat is hitting Sydney, but particularly the western suburbs, more so than coastal suburbs. But having said that, it can still get, you know, very, very hot and uncomfortable for a lot of people in Willoughby as well. Again, a challenge for many local governments and authorities. A metro station is being built at Sydney Olympic Park, will be open in 2032. And part of the big challenge there is that the one precinct that has a 30% tree canopy, central precinct, almost all of those trees are going to be lost to urban development. So how do we lose that kind of high value green infrastructure like trees on private land and replace that? So this is a big challenge for all councils and state governments and territory. You know, the whole of government issue is this densification has a lot of benefits. We know a lot about housing at the moment, a lot of talk, but of course this is essential blue and green infrastructure, and we're going to talk about all the benefits that blue and green infrastructure delivers. So looking at the canopy mapping that I did there a couple of years ago, how do we replace that? How do we manage tree canopy? I'm just not getting the next one. And so one of the principles that is written in the National Handbook is this thing about not just focusing on planting lots and lots of small trees all the time, is that councils and state governments and other people need to work much harder to protect the trees that we actually have already. So this is a line of brush box trees that were part of just an access track out to a depot, and a road was pushed through about 10 years ago, and it's got biofiltration, it's got a rain garden on the left, and this top pic on the right side picture. We've got permeable curbing. I know that Willoughby Council's doing a lot of this work. This is a classic case of blue infrastructure that supports green infrastructure. So instead of putting the stormwater runoff from that road in a pipe and putting it straight into the harbour, it's going and back into and feeding these trees, and they're certainly a lot healthier since they've been tapping into all this stormwater runoff, and the biofiltration and the plantings that strip out some of the pollutants and other sorts of things that come off the road. And you can see that even though this is not summer, that it's quite a shaded road, and it's been really good to say that all the office workers that have to walk out to where they work from the heavy rail station get to enjoy these established trees that were probably planted about 80 years ago. And now we've built a new road. But it took a lot of work working with engineers, irrigation people, a whole lot of different disciplines have to come together to pull these projects off. Another unique opportunity, and this is not necessarily the case for all places and all trees, but this large urban canopy retention can be that these two trees were actually sitting in the future road corridor, that other street, the stage 2 extension of Murray Rose Avenue. Beautiful fig trees, again, 80 years old, very high value. We were able to move those into a new park, and you can see down on the left-hand picture between those two telecom towers, those two large trees. Well, they were moved about 100 metres, and the people that do this work are highly specialised tree contractors. They use the D9 bulldozers and all that big equipment, but they're specialists. It takes about 6 months to prep the trees, lift them, move them, put them down, and you have this instant, so there's no net loss of canopy. It does take a lot of time and planning, but it is possible to do this with certain species of fig trees, palms, hoop pines, and a lot of deciduous trees at the right time of the year, but it takes good policy and good planning. And of course, you've got to have the available space to move trees into, and that can be a problem as we densify. But in this case, it's a new community neighbourhood park that's not quite finished yet, but all of the trees in that park have all been lifted up and moved from several hundred metres away. There's now outdoor yoga and Pilates under that fig tree on the bottom right-hand corner. And it's been great to think, when it was just a depot full of wood chips and bricks and weeds, and now that it's becoming a real community resource. Getting back to SIMPACT and what happened. So look, we know these events. This is the black summer of 2019-2020. Extreme heat. Again, a park built on landfill. I know that the Willoughby Reserve is also built on landfill. It's probably not as prone to drying out as Bicentennial Park, but let's just say here we saw an extended period of drought and dryness, and then came in this extremely hot weather, and then the irrigation failed at 10 days at the worst possible time. So between Christmas and New Year's Eve, that period when there was no one working, there were no spare parts, for 10 days the park was reliant on manual watering. And I said to my colleague, Dr. Fausch, who I just met as a world-leading scientist into urban heat adaptation, we went out and viewed the park when it was in this condition, And I said, Dr. Fausch, what are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? And that's how the SIMP CT project grew out of this really bad stuff. A bit like what happened at Castle Cove, a lot of good things can come out of bad events. It really shakes the tree, and this is how the SIMP CT project was born. So there's Dr. Fausch test flying his thermal imaging camera. It's not your typical drone, it's worth about $80,000, it's got some special camera. He's been leading this benchmarking and heat mapping all across Western Sydney, Campbelltown, Cumberland, Parramatta, and I think Willoughby's now the first coastal suburb to take on board his expertise. The mapping, a bit like what you're doing, we're going to talk about that in a minute, the loggers, so he put it across the whole LGA of Parramatta, and not surprisingly, the more elevated suburbs back up towards Epping are cooler, they're more elevated, they've got more tree cover. Back around towards Parramatta and the western and southern parts of Parramatta, you can see that it's much hotter. Sorry, my slide's a little bit blurry, but you get the general intent of where things are warmer and cooler. And you'll see a very similar slide coming up for Willoughby in a minute. We even got down into a more granular level of looking at which species of trees are more heat resistant. Again, this is a little bit fuzzy, but there are species listed on the left-hand side in the brown box up in the top left corner, and we can actually look at the effectiveness of different species of trees. So not just the forest of lumping everything together. If you really want to get granular about what are the tree species that are going to be the best ones to put in the future, things like Ficus hillii, which we have a lot in the park, end up being sort of some of the densest, shadiest and most future-proof trees that we can use in urban spaces in Western Sydney. Fortunately, the park has those trees. It also has a lot of deciduous trees, and some of those trees have not survived the 1920 black summer and didn't die straight away, but then after getting waterlogged, only 6 months later, some of those trees that have been there since 1988 have died. So now that raises the question, what should we put back? Do we put back the same species, or do we look at a more future-proof species? And that's still ongoing work for the authority. SIMPACT, this is the collaterals that were brought out, the blueprint, the roadmap. There's a lot of partners involved in it. The website's still live, but I think the sensors are going to be turned off in about 3 weeks' time, but it's been live for people to access. It's got a customer-facing dashboard where you can call up the SIMPACT website, and those sensor networks will give you live information. Sorry, these are the partners that went into the project. You can see there's a lot of different government departments and universities and specialists involved. I've got some more information on that, but the website does actually provide all this information if you're into the tech and you want to know more about this project. This is some of the images. So you saw Sebastian was flying the thermal imaging camera. So he can look at, where we're looking at buildings and built form next to parks. The cooling impact of the park stretches across a couple hundred metres into the town centre, because Sebastian had heat sensors into the urban core as well as those in the park. So that park cooling effect shows that where we have bodies of water, whether it's salt water or fresh water, in this case Lake Belvedere, there is a cooling effect that does extend beyond the park. And it shows up, hot surfaces like roads and buildings do trap heat. This is again a bit of a blurry one. There were some screen takes from a workshop, but this was work in progress, but on the website you can pull in, and so if you're a water manager, you can look at where the drier parts of the park are, the slide on the left, and the slide on the right actually has the relatively, what are the hottest and coolest parts of the park, and it can tell you where the coolest and hottest parts are on the website. I haven't got those slides now, but this is the sort of thing that comes out of having those 250 sensors. Now, this information was available to visitors to the park, residents, to work out, I want to walk the dog, I want to go take my kids for play, what's the coolest part of the park, or they might be visitors renting an Airbnb or someone staying at the hotel. So it was designed for both managers and visitors, so it had this sort of double face. This Park Live has been developed. If you go on the website, it's still there, but I think some of the sensors are starting to be shut down. It's been running for about 3 years, and the sorts of data it was telling you was, and again apologies for the slightly blurry images, was what the temperatures were at the precise time you were looking on the website, hottest and coolest, driest, etc. So It may not be a project that necessarily comes to Willoughby, but I think how you can use this live data on soil moisture and air temperature is quite interesting. So back to Willoughby, what can we do? And if you're a resident or you have a small business and you're thinking, you know, the value of trees, people often talk about some of the downside of trees, but they don't often talk about the upside. And I guess this talk is trying to emphasise that what we call community cooling, that together the critical mass of trees in people's gardens does make a difference. And if you working with your neighbours can value your trees as nature's air conditioning, that there is a benefit. There's many other co-benefits as well, and we'll get to that in a minute, but really the emphasis today is about cooling, community cooling, rethinking of trees as green infrastructure and all the benefits they bring. But your responsibility, and I have large trees where I live, one of the things that I would recommend is you keep them safe, protect your trees. I get mine regularly pruned by a professional arborist to keep the tree safe because it's a big tree. I didn't plant the tree at my house, it was put in about 80 years ago, but I love the tree and my neighbours love the tree, but I look after it like the rest of my house. I maintain it. These are some of the wonderful things that Willoughby's been doing, and I've been driving all over Willoughby and I've been getting my collection. This is a great campaign, so hats off to all the Willoughby people that have been doing this great community engagement campaign, because I think it's absolutely fantastic what's been done. It's very much down at street level, and I hope that this continues because I think this has been very successful. Some slides that were given to me to present on Sebastian's work, and sorry Nick, there's a little bit slightly fuzzy, but I think people will get the trend. So this is the canopy mapping, and some of the work that Dr. Fausch is doing for Willoughby Council is looking at things like canopy. So there's a target that Council's going for, which is 40%. That's sort of accepted as a good industry target in an Australian context to get some kind of a maximum cooling benefit. So you can see that Willoughby, on average, is doing relatively well, but of course, like with all the pressure coming from densification, a lot of those numbers can track downwards before they come up again. So the canopy target of 40% is good, but you can see it's not evenly distributed. Parts of Willoughby to the west and the east are where we do have a lot of urban bushland, but in the more urbanised central portions of Artarmon and Chatswood, there's more work, and even towards the parts of Narromburn there as well. Artarmon, I think you can see that there's not a lot of tree cover because of the large buildings and the land use. So this is sort of some of the baseline mapping of heat, and again it shows you that there is a benefit to be near water, in this case Middle Harbour. The bushlands around the harbour add to that, and some of the bushland, larger stretches of bushlands towards the west. And you can see that as you get into the more built-up environments, not surprisingly, it's hotter. But this tells you relatively, the differences between those more shaded areas or those areas that have more water and bushland or large parks. And you're looking at anywhere between, 3 to 10 degrees difference depending on the day. And that's very significant. It's a benchmark study that WSU is doing at the moment. So while we had 250 sensors out at Olympic Park, we had underground sensors as well, but I think these ones, Nick, are just all sitting probably at 3 metres. I think this is what Sebastian normally does to be consistent with really looking at air temperature where humans are. And it's been extended across the hot period from December right through until March. And I think there's been a couple of exceptionally hot days that Sebastian, I think he's been tracking the data every day, but he can particularly look at peaks, extreme heat events. And look, Council's hoping that the feedback from all this baseline mapping of urban heat mapping, will impact on future policies and strategies and actions around buildings, design of the public domain, education and promotion, which we're doing today. Well done, education team, because we've got to put this back to a range of audiences of school children, people in business, other people. So I think, and policy people that work in council and state government, this is very important to have this data. Tree planting, of course, is a way of responding to it by tracking canopy you've got to look at those assets and are they shrinking, are they growing? And then there's a localised heat study in Edward Street and Penshurst Street that we've put in some slides, and I understand that there is some capital works being allocated from council to put in more blue and green infrastructure. So again, water sensitive urban design, which is a technical term for rain gardens, and again that's a way of using the water that's running off the road and hard surface like footpaths and putting it to where the trees and the plants are. So you get a wonderful benefit of cleaning the stormwater, but using it to sustain the new green infrastructure of street trees and the planting that's underneath them. There's new bike lanes, pedestrian crossings. So it's a classic green, grey and blue infrastructure solution. I think in this particular one, a bit more detail on the loggers, Edward and Penshurst. So looking at, where there's only a low canopy of 20% versus where you've got, very high canopy. So here's a particular example, 7th to 9th of December. So up to 42 degrees, and how much hotter that, as I said, 8 degrees. So it gives you very good proof of just how hot it can get when you don't have much canopy in an urban environment, and how you can combat that with more blue and green infrastructure and street tree planting. So back to maybe if you're looking from home and you're wondering, what's that got to do with me? Well, this is a good campaign that was run by Planning New South Wales. It's still on their website, and it's a nice simple way of thinking about green infrastructure and trees on your land and other vegetation, the benefits around privacy, shade, wildlife. Some of it can be edible. There's benefits from having edible trees as well. Community cooling, which I'm talking about today. And we all know through COVID that just getting out when you needed to get out of the house, the benefits that you get from health and wellbeing, mental health, physical health as well. Again, if you want to look at a broader set of benefits, there's so much going on here in things like carbon sequestration, even what we call around preventing flooding or sponge cities. Those rain gardens and those bioswales that council are putting in, they help absorb and buffer flood events and flash flooding. So that's another benefit of green infrastructure. And you can see here, combating climate change, but wildlife, it's good for our public health. So it's what we call co-benefits. This is the kind of infrastructure that we all need more of because there's just so many benefits. And I'm just finishing with a slide that Sebastian provided. Now, this is an artist that works with AI, and this is a good slide that sort of typifies maybe the future that we're heading towards. We know we've got a lot of solar panels in Willoughby and Australia, but green roofs, green walls, which are not really something that are coming yet very much to. You might see a few green walls and green facades around, but there's a lot of work at a national level that I'm involved in at the moment to bring up technical standards for things like green facades and green walls and green roofs. City of Sydney have been doing a bit of that work. I don't think Willoughby's still probably working on a policy for that, but one of the issues that's been holding it back is the lack of national standards or performance specifications. So we're hoping to see this as sort of the future built form of places like Chatswood, where we've got density and can't always be solved with trees. We can put trees on buildings, but it's just a matter of thinking a little bit more creative about this sort of the opportunities that come out of a hotter, drier climate, but a more livable urban environment. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and I think I know we started about 7 or 8 minutes behind the starting time, so I think I've kept to my allocated time. I'm getting a thumbs up there from the timekeeper. Thank you, Leanne. So, David, talking stick back to you.
Thank you, David.